Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Madison, and I will be the technical manager for this session today on a right to food and nutrition shared by Jody Harris. So thank you so much for taking part in ANH 2022, and we look forward to a really robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything you may need to access conference materials and the program can be found on the ANH Academy website at anh-academy.org/ANH2022. So thank you so much again for joining, everyone, and I'm going to hand it over to Jody to kick us off.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julia. Welcome, everybody. Swetha and I are really happy to see you all at this side event on a right to food and nutrition. So we have a 1 hour session today. It's pretty brief. So if you have any questions while the speakers are speaking, do put those into the chat. And then we will try and make some time at the end to go over those, but we're also going to be talking about ways to continue this conversation beyond the hour that we have together today. So the aim of this session is to illustrate how the concept of human rights might be applied to issues relevant to ANH and the Academy, and then to explore if there's any interest in further work in this area at the Academy. So we have a great set of speakers today who are going to give us perspectives on human rights that are relevant to ANH work from policy and legal and research and practice perspectives. So let me just introduce us briefly at the beginning. So my name's Jody Harris. I'm an applied researcher with a particular interest in the politics and ethics of food systems. So I'm currently a senior researcher at the World Vegetable Center, and I try and bring a food systems and policy research to focus on healthy diets. I'm also a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, where I try to further conceptual thinking on ideas like power and equity and ethics and rights in nutrition. So later on, I'm going to be giving an overview of some human rights in nutrition research in Zambia. We also are very happy to have with us today Serena Pepino. So Serena is a right to food policy expert. She's also alternate team leader of the right to food team at the Food and Agriculture Organization. So she's dedicated to ensure that the human right to adequate food is understood and addressed across the work of FAO. So she supports governments, provides technical backstopping to national processes towards the progressive realization of the right to food. So a very broad view of this over a long time. And Serena's going to give us an overview of the history of sort of policy and action in this field to set the scene in a moment. We're also very happy to have with us David Kabanda. So David is a social rights lawyer with a special interest in social justice in trade and food systems. He's the director of the Center for Food and Adequate Living Rights, which is a CSO working on right to food issues using legal and judiciary instruments in Africa. So David's going to present experiences of bringing legal rights into policy and implementation with a focus on Uganda. And my co-host for this meeting is Swetha Manohar. So Swetha is a fellow at the Johns Hopkins University in the Global Food Ethics and Policy Program. And her work focuses on conceptualizing and bringing context to equitable, ethical, and sustainable diets and food systems, and particularly the intersection of human rights and food security. So Swetha is going to give us an overview of the new People-Centered Food Systems project at Johns Hopkins, and then present the next steps in taking this area of rights forward, perhaps in conjunction with the Academy. So we're really happy to have everybody here today. Thank you so much all for making the time. So let's get started first of all, and Serena, then over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody, and thank you for the organizers and for everyone that is here with us today. I'm very happy to set the scene of this very, very interesting side event. Let's get us started. So I'm going to talk to you today about, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the history of the human right to adequate food. We're going to go through some of the global milestones, main policy action that have to be taken in order for the right to food to be realized. And I'm going to briefly touch on the important role that academic institutions play to this end. Please, Jody. So the normative and programmatic foundations of the right to food are extremely broad, and we're going to go through most of them in a minute. one thing that I usually start my presentations with is an excerpt from a speech by Eleanor Roosevelt from 1958. I'm always touched by this, and I really think that it's a very powerful statement to remember, because what she said was she wondered essentially where human rights begin. And they don't start from big plenaries or courts or the UN fora, whatnot, but she said they started small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. And unless these rights have the meaning there, they have very little meaning anyway. And this is very important to remember. And we're going to go through the elements of universality, interconnection, interdependence of human rights, and how they're important at the individual, collective level, as much as the, let's say, more accountable duty bearers level. So I apologize, maybe the graphic is not ideal, but this is a snapshot of the right to food at a glance. So just to give you a few of the most important milestones that have over the years defined the content of the right to food from an international human rights law perspective. And you can see the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1976 ICSCR, and moving on, the different World Food Security and Food Summit that have defined further the needed type of commitment and action the government had to take in order for this human right to be realized. The General Comment 12 that we're going to go through in a minute, the 2004 Right to Food Guideline adopted by the Council of the FAO, all the way to big event affirming the roles of particular stakeholders such as the Global Parliamentary Summit Against Hunger and Malnutrition. And one big milestone that is missing from this, because it's a little older, part of a publication that is pre-2021 is obviously the UN Food System Summit, where human rights were considered as a cluster action area needed in order to ensure sustainability of food systems. So if we just zoom in a little bit on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the Article 25, we start getting a little bit of a feel of that element of interconnectedness and the universality that I mentioned earlier, because the right to food is not found on its own in international normative. From the Universal Declaration, we see that it's part of the of a standard of living that puts together health, including food. In the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, same thing in the Article 11, the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living includes food as well as health, housing, and other human rights. And it's linked to the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. So right there, we basically have an intrinsic connection between life and food. And freedom of hunger, incidentally, is a constitution, is part of the FAO constitution. So the FAO is the only UN specialized agency with the explicit mandate to support its member countries as far as the elimination of hunger and malnutrition through a human rights-based approach, as it is in the case of all the UN system. And we're also going to see that in a minute. Other important global milestones include the General Comment 12 by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Obviously, it's a long document, and I could only put there what it is now commonly considered as the definition of the right to food. But why is this document so important? And I really encourage everyone to go read it. It actually gives the entry points and the key dimension for the operationalization of the human right to liquid food. The former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food used to say that working on the right to food basically means working with everything that exists under the sun. And it's true, if you look at the General Comment 12, you can really see all different policy areas that are going to eventually affect it in one way or another. You have the four pillars of food security: availability, sustainability, adequacy, and accessibility. But you also have dietary adequacy, consumer acceptability, you have food loss and waste, food safety, sustainability, access to natural resources. There's so many different components and different policy action that, unless taken in a coherent way with each other and towards the right to food and other human rights, they could have a negative trade-off in terms of individuals and communities enjoying the right to food. In 2000, the UN Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food was established as an official mandate. It's an extremely important one, together with, I think there's 35 or 40 others. Don't quote me on that number. For the FAO, it's a very special rapporteur because it's the one that looks after the one human right that FAO holds at its core. So there's a very strong relationship between these two institutions. The World Food Summits, like I said, they also define further the need for policy guidance on the right to food, and we will see how these impacted the decision of putting together a set of voluntary guidelines that were later on adopted by the FAO Council. And let's also remember that because the right to food cannot be seen in isolation, other binding instruments included as a core human right that must be respected, protected, and fulfilled at all times, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And like I said, finally, the UN Food System Summit was also key to remind us all of the importance of human rights as a catalyst to ensure food system sustainability. Let's quickly zoom into the ICSR. There are some elements that were then later on taken and that helped build momentum for a UN reform that would promote the human rights-based approach. The convention essentially already included the idea of progressive realization. Human rights cannot be realized overnight. In order to ensure respect, protection, and fulfillment, several steps have to be taken in a progressive manner, including ensuring that maximum available resources are utilized and set and put in place, set aside for this purpose, and highlights already the importance role of development cooperation, international development cooperation. So it's not only a national business, but it's also an international business. National as well as regional and global action should ensure that the human rights principles are duly followed and guide all processes of development programming. In FAO, we have a funny acronym, which is the PANTHER, that encapsulates some of the human rights principles that include participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, human dignity, empowerment, and the rule of law. But let's not forget equality, inclusion, and all of these principles that really must guide our work in and outside of the UN system in order to ensure the realization of human rights. So, as I said, the covenant really guided that reform at the UN level that called in 1996 the Secretary General to ask all entities of the UN system to mainstream human rights into their various activities and programs within the framework of their respective mandates. Like I said earlier, FAO has a very unique bond with the right to food, but it also must pay attention, and it does ensure that other important human rights such as decent work, social protection, the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of women and children, and so on and so forth, are duly backstopped. In 2003, a UN common memorandum of understanding was finally adopted, which called for a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. And in the next slide, we're going to see what that entails. So the three main principles of an HRBA are the identifications of duty bearers, so those that are responsible to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, and the rights holders. All human beings that are entitled to human rights. They don't have just needs, that have entitlement, that must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. And like I said earlier, programmatic action has to be guided by the human rights principles that are considered as a vehicle for their realization. So let me try and show you what we mean by it. In the context of food security, a very technical approach to food security would acknowledge certain needs of affected population or the so-called vulnerable groups or our target groups or beneficiaries in terms of availability of food, access to food, stability, and food utilization. And many food security policies and programs address very well these technical issues, and they are effective. But then if you really go into the context-specific vulnerability at the national level, you realize that a purely technical food security approach is not enough. What we need is a rights-based approach that addresses critical governance dimensions, vulnerability dimensions, socioeconomic and cultural dimensions that are not otherwise reflected in a food security, in a purely food security approach. Let's see how this tempo changes when we apply a rights-based lens to it. So the ultimate goal of our action is no longer food security, it's actually the right to adequate food, which through the 4 pillars of food security is realized. But what does guide our food security action? The principles. So we ensure that in order to get to a full realization of the right to food, all stakeholders that need to have a seat around the table are involved. The states becomes fully accountable, and other accountable institutions are involved in the process. Think of, for instance, the role of oversight that is fulfilled by parliaments, no? For instance, that a non-discriminatory approach is applied, transparent action is taken, and the people that are our beneficiaries and targets are empowered. They become agent of the process as opposed to passive recipients of policy action. And at the bottom of the temple, there's not an acknowledgement of simple needs, but an acknowledgement of human rights and entitlements that come from a rights-based human rights framework, which is binding for all the states that are parties of the international instruments that we saw earlier. So some key messages that are very important to take away with us today is that a human rights-based approach to food security and nutrition asks us to look at food as a matter of rights and not as charity, which is a common misconception in the work that we do. And I'm sure that you know that very well, that it's very different to have a charitable action towards food, but promoting an actual rights-based, sustainable, and enabling environment to promote the right to food is quite a different thing. States are duty bearers and individuals are right holders. We talk about entitlements rather than needs. The claim mechanisms are incredibly important because accountability needs to be fulfilled by the ability of the duty bearers to communicate to the rights holders. And the claim mechanisms, judicial, administrative, or political, can do just that. The focus has to be on the outcome as well as on the process and the structures. And we must really do our homework right at the level of assessments, monitoring and evaluation, ensuring that we tackle the root causes of hunger and identify the most vulnerable to ensure that there's a multi-sectoral and stakeholder approach that defines the problems and finds sustainable solutions through this so-called enabling environment. So the FAO was pioneered the adoption of a policy guidance tool, the Right to Food guidelines, that were adopted by its council in November 2004. And they are a very practical tool to implement the right to food and all the obligations that come with it. But it's not binding per se. What it asks states to do, though, is to remember that there's a binding human rights framework that governs member states' actions towards food security and nutrition, and asks to tackle the root causes of hunger. It guides on how to set an enabling of environment through legislation, policies, and programs, and international development cooperation, and many other policy areas that we're going to talk about in a minute. Apply the human rights principle and really look at the broad picture to promote coherence across the different policy realms. They are obviously context-based, but part of the commitment of any given state. To look at what are the different ways that we can implement the right to food. Like I said, laws, policies, and programs and strategies and actions, they really do provide us with the normative backdrop to ensure that there are regulatory frameworks in place that can trigger accountability mechanisms. The policy commitments are well explained and outlined in policy tools, and the actionable programs and strategies and plans are put in place with adequate resources. But we need all actors involved. And here I just want to spend 2 seconds to talk about the role of academic institutions as very, very important to, for instance, guarantee not only that there is evidence and research and data that sometimes states are not able to fulfill, but obviously colleagues will be able to tell us more about that in a minute. But one thing that we found, as I feel incredibly crucial, is the role that academia, for instance, plays in monitoring and providing oversight and supporting all the different branches of the government in terms of the protection, fulfillment, and respect of the right to food, for instance. And one example that I'm happy to elaborate later, if anyone is interested, are the right to food observatories that started to flourish in the past 20 years, and we find them in many different countries. And in particular, there are extremely good practices that are available in Spain and in some other, and in some Latin American countries. So really, it is about equipping key people with the knowledge and skills and ensure that everyone that is involved in the process is it becomes agent of their future, not just recipient, like I said, of any action. And through the promotion of policy coherence in very different policy realms, from social protection to education, housing, health, all connected. We get to one last point that I wanted to make, which is the power and the importance of nutrition to the realization of the right to food. Like I said earlier, the General Comment 12 really highlights some of the key dimensions that ensure that the right to food can be realized. Nutrition is considered in the adequacy, in the word adequacy, which is part of the title of the right to food, as an essential element to ensure its realization. And it's not just seen in a narrow perspective in terms of micronutrients or dietary needs. It's actually looked at in a very holistic way. So let's not forget that the right to nutrition exists, and it has to be fulfilled for the right to food to be realized. And I thank you, and I stop here, and I hope that I haven't gone too overboard with my minutes, and over to you, colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Serena. That's fantastic overview of such a complex field in just a few minutes. It's fantastic to have that very big, broad overview, and we can certainly dive more into that. So now we're going to zoom in a bit with David's presentation and look at the role of rights in policy and its application specifically. So David, please, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be sharing experiences of how we are taking forward the right to food in policy and how it is being applied. I have started with an outline, and those are the main points that I'll be making and how we have been using the right to food. I'll straight away go into the first bullet and specifically talking about, of course, this is what my colleague has been talking about as elements which are very central to the human rights-based approach. Human dignity, transparency, participation, rule of law. Now, when we had the lockdown due to COVID-19, we used the human rights-based approach to go to court, specifically asking the government to make sure that people are able to access food This is what my colleague was talking about, looking at vulnerabilities. Some people are vulnerable, others are too weak, they can't even get food. Now, is there a legal framework? And this one comes back to the critical principle, which is rule of law. So we went to court and was specifically looking at having protocols, safeguards in the pandemic, and how food can be sustainably got. We were very honored when the court acknowledged that although the right to food is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution of Uganda, but all Ugandans and people in East Africa have that right to food. And government was ordered to at least look at the vulnerabilities, and people are supposed to be getting the food. Now, from that case, we saw how significant it is to break down the normative content of the right to food. And this is because it helps to have the right determined and what are the particular elements. You see, the right to food is not like other rights that have received a lot of research and writing. And from our experiences, we saw that judicial officers have a lot of uncertainty when it comes to what are the particular elements of the right to food. And we also experienced that public officers have a somewhat misunderstanding when it comes to the right to adequate food and the right to be fed, because they were ever coming back to us and they are asking, do you want us to feed everyone? We can't do that. And what we're telling them, no, this right does not require you to feed me. It requires you to put a system in place, a framework in place, follow the law, such that everyone can be able to access food and they can be able, the food is available and it can be accessed. Now, understanding the experiences of effective participation and inclusivity, many of the cases and why we have hunger and malnutrition is because many people are not engaged. Then we need to see research in the direction of who compensates for people who die because of hunger, and who analyzes this data, and do we have the tools for that analysis? These are critical questions that I have found asking myself and also policymakers asking, and what is the monitoring framework? For example, a country like Uganda, and you can even go to the African continent, do countries have like a monitoring framework, context specific for countries? Yes, I know FAO has, but has this been implemented at country level? Do we have any protocols that are specific on hunger and contamination of food if I wanted to do a monitoring and an audit? And do we have, for example, audit of these death victims? Can we have renowned researchers, for example, maybe working with UN agencies like FAO? And when we are talking about effective participation, have we had researchers look into issues of legal empowerment? And have they given us, for example, modules for public interest engagement of everyone? And we think that when you look at all the hunger and the malnutrition we have, it is an interplay between national, starting from a minute society called a family, going to an individual, to national governments, region, up to international level. How do we then look at these vulnerabilities, but link into international decisions and the emergencies or insurgencies that we have seen? For example, I'm mentioning Uganda and the honey market. Right now, we cannot, as Uganda, sell honey to outside countries because when we got locust invasion, we used spraying. The government just randomly sprayed and killing many bees and also contaminating the environment. So now the honey is contaminated. Secondly, have we looked into research that goes into food reserve systems? Last week I was in Germany, and they are running, they have forgotten about the food reserve systems that they used to have. Right now, in a developing country like Uganda, we are affected because there is a war in Ukraine and Russia. And for me, it is a shame. Can we help countries understand how important maybe Africa food reserves are important, maybe African Union, African state, and how they can come up with a policy coherence when it comes to food and in emergency areas, and how we can make use of international regional laws. Then the right to food will help us also target third parties, because as you've heard from my colleague, we are talking about the right to protect. The food industry is hiding into taking advantage of people's choices and what they like to eat. And there's too much ethics in it, and taking advantage of the children, and the food fraud that is happening, the chemical use in terms of fertilizers and synthetics and the GMOs. And the question is, can the researchers also involve themselves in finding whether we have the capacity to contain the GMOs and the science? Yes, technology is very good for food security, but do we have the capacity at institutional level to contain, do we have the capacity, as in many African countries, to understand the technology, the science, and maybe taking the precautionary principle on these third parties? And can we manage them? Because they are too powerful. Some of them, the Monsantos of this world, might even be having a budget bigger than specific countries. Take examples of bigger sweetened beverage companies. We need to have research that brings out these issues clearly for people to understand them. And this is my last slide. We are looking at emerging jurisprudence. We need to help courts understand what do we mean when we talk about the right to food. And this is where I think many researchers come in to do research, for example, on African continent, and making an audit of what courts are doing, because every judgment that a country passes or a court passes becomes law in itself. So we need to see what is happening at AU level, ESC level, COMESA, ECOWAS, IGAD, African Commission, and then we see how these courts are playing. Next. At the heart of human rights-based approach, this is my conclusion, is a key understanding that unequal power relations, where we find ourselves, including the powerful industries, but also in forms, looking at gender dynamics, looking at the economic exclusion and other exclusion parameters, which deny people a living and they continuously keep them in poverty. Thank you so much. I'll stop here. Let me hope I have limited myself within the time allocated.
Perfect, David, thank you. And it's so interesting to hear about these thorny issues that come up when we try to translate those big global ideas that Serena was talking about into a national context like Uganda. So absolutely fascinating, thank you. And I'm sure there'll be some questions nearer the end about some of those. So I was really pleased that there were some questions raised there by David about research. So I want to just move on to giving a quick overview of one piece of research that we did recently. So we've heard an excellent overview of right to food in policy. We've heard about the practical action through the law and implementation now from David. So I want to give you an example of research on human rights and nutrition, because we're at a research conference. Now, we heard from Serena that there isn't necessarily a specific right to nutrition in the international covenants. It's a right to food, which encompasses nutrition. But we, my colleagues listed on this slide, had heard a lot of people talking about this thing called a right to nutrition. And without deciding whether it was right or wrong to have a right to nutrition, we wanted to understand what people thought they meant at different levels when they were talking about a right to nutrition. So we were looking at this thing called a right to nutrition through different lenses, social, legal, and political lenses in our research. So as background, I've been working for the past 15 years or so in Zambia, where the nutrition situation is pretty dire. I think we're probably all aware of the numbers. So lots of people are working to address these issues in lots of different ways. And one of those ways, of course, is working on human rights. So the inspiration for this work back in around 2017 was that we noticed that lots of global nutrition organizations and also Zambian national policies reference human rights among guiding principles for addressing malnutrition. But in years of working in this field, I hadn't seen much evidence of human rights guiding action on nutrition at any level. And people I spoke to informally either weren't clear on what that action should be, or sometimes had quite conflicting views on what that should be. So we wanted to understand through our research how the kind of exclamations on this slide touch on the malnutrition realities that we saw on the previous slide. So we felt there was a need to better understand how human rights have shaped or might shape nutrition action as slightly separate or different to food, although encompassed in it in some frameworks. So we wanted to just understand that in order to make better decisions about how and where to invest the energy of the nutrition community going forward. And then we might have something to say about human rights work in general from that case study. So our work explored empirically how a right to nutrition is perceived by different actors at global level, at Africa regional level, and then at multiple levels within Zambia. And then we wanted to understand how differences in that interpretation might affect its potential for reducing malnutrition eventually. So what did we find? So at the international level, and Serena's already given an amazing overview of this, but there's a whole raft of covenants and conventions and strategies that affirm the right to food, but also mention a right to nutrition and its various determinants. So human rights are clearly integrated with ideas of nutrition and of nutrition's core determinants, food and health and care and gender issues and all of these things that we know underpin nutrition. They're all there in the written covenants and conventions and policy across international, but also regional and also national levels. So rights covenants are becoming a bit more explicit on issues of nutrition as well as food, globally and regionally. And rights are mentioned in high-level strategy in Zambia, nutrition strategy in Zambia. But that rights language is often used without a very clear meaning of what it means on the ground. And we saw that in David's presentation a minute ago in some instances. So across different levels of documents. And we found that the language on a right to nutrition becomes weaker and less defined and eventually actually disappears altogether. And the population groups covered get narrower and narrower, sort of focusing on children and sometimes women, as the documents get closer to being actionable within the Zambian national context. So recognizing that in interviews for this research, lots of respondents at international and national levels suggested that rights language perhaps was being deployed as a sort of rhetorical device rather than a clear basis for action. So some policy actors at international level described rights as occurring in preambles, but then being lost in practice. And some civil society actors described rights as being seen as window dressing or a public relations measure, which of course is not how they're intended. So we find that the language of rights is sort of a moral call to action. It provides a range of conceptual ideas, moral leverage, but it doesn't always define and direct action in clear and consistent ways. So we needed to move on to other questions to look at that. So in our interviews with respondents at international level, there was disagreement about what constitutes a right to nutrition and even whether it should be a separate right. Some people think yes, some people think no, it's already interpreted in the right to food. So at national level in Zambia, respondents made links to these interconnected sets of rights that Serena was talking about, But then they went further in describing the more sort of practical aspects of what claiming a right to nutrition might mean in the Zambian context, and particularly in terms of related policy and programmatic ideas. And then going even sort of deeper into the Zambian context, focus groups with Zambian citizens revealed that even more sort of practical orientations to the idea of this thing that might be a right to nutrition at the community level. So in Zambia, rights was actually a difficult concept to grasp in several groups, partly because Zambian languages don't actually have a direct translation of the word rights. So it came to be understood of something like the ability to freely choose what one eats or buys or cultivates without interference. But often the idea didn't reference an obligation of support from the state, for instance. So it's difficult to talk about an idea when there isn't language to talk about it. Respondents did see a practical role for the state and for civil society in helping people to overcome the sort of barriers to this freedom, but they were certainly less vocal about seeing any obligation on the state as any kind of duty bearer. So that idea had not filtered all the way down. So views on what a right to nutrition means in practice clearly change across levels, from the international technical experts to the understanding of national citizens. And that means that a right to nutrition lacks a norm. And a norm is like a morally grounded, a collectively shared, specific, social, obligatory idea with clear duties and consequences for defined actors. So for malnutrition, I mean, clearly the moral frame for action exists and it's shaped the policy, the covenants, the rhetoric. But the lack of a norm means that there's no consensus across those levels on who should be acting and what they should be doing and what should be the consequences if they don't. So the question that arises then is the extent to which the language that is used in these different covenants grants valuable legal rights to the citizens of Zambia. And this mirrors what David was just saying about Uganda. So one way that these global documents have been used more concretely is that Zambia has domesticated some international human rights law to an extent. So for instance, the Affiliation and Maintenance of Children Act in 1995 in Zambia specifically domesticates the UN Convention on the Rights to the Child into Zambian law. But crucially, when it was domesticated, the domesticated version makes no reference to the original provisions in that UN document relating to food, nutrition, health, or care. So those rights are not justiciable in the Zambian courts. You can't bring those to court because they're not there in the domestic version. And then since Zambia has a dualist legal system, so it has customary law as well as the formal sort of common law legal system. So the ordinary courts where these kinds of human rights cases might be heard, even if you could get them to court, are not easily accessible to much of the population. So at the international and regional levels, these rights are there, they're full of content, they're broad, they're applicable to all, they're non-discriminatory. But there's no real enforcement mechanism available to the ordinary Zambian individual at this level. A really strong legal right, as David was saying, to nutrition would have clear content, it would have a clear scope and strong enforceability mechanism for the individual to hold the state to account. And interestingly, during the course of our research in 2019, a critical moment occurred whereby this case law actually emerged. So there was a case called Mwanza and Bean against the Attorney General of Zambia, and it relates to food provision for adult prisoners. So in that case, the appellants who brought this to court were HIV positive, and they were in custody at Lusaka Central Prison. And they claimed that the state-provided food was not adequate in quantity and nutritional content. It didn't take account of their health condition, and so they said this was a breach to their rights to life and to be protected from inhuman and degrading treatment under the Zambian constitution. And the Supreme Court of Zambia agreed. They upheld that decision. So here what we see is that the use of national law then brings a real strengthening of that policy. It makes it justiciable, it makes it enforceable in a national court of law. So here the Supreme Court held that the right to life encompasses a right to nutrition, but it also brings a narrowing of focus. So those broad and sweeping rights that were indivisible and for everybody in the international covenants are now very highly specific in this case to a population of HIV-positive prisoners. So this study of a right to nutrition in global and Zambian contexts highlighted a few things. It highlighted the broad and rhetorical nature of calls to rights in many policies, national policies, and also the global covenants and organizational mandates. It also shows how that language has really shaped in more concrete ways the engagement of Zambian law with a right to nutrition, albeit one of a more limited scope in order to achieve that legal justiciability. And the possibility that sort of moments like that legal case can be grasped by activists to shape the law in ways that's even more supportive of the right. It's also highlighted the lack of action in practice, particularly in the areas of access to the law and participation and accountability that might enable ordinary Zambian citizens to access those rights through legal mechanisms or through engagement with the authorities. So in Zambia, that's the conclusion. We also have a final point that's perhaps more broadly applicable across different countries, but also across different rights. So a major point that our research demonstrates is that there are three distinct aspects to the ways that human rights are understood and used. And this tripartite structure hasn't been made clear in previous work on nutrition, and we haven't seen it in work on rights more generally. So we're just wondering if it may be a useful sort of heuristic for people. So we have rights as rhetorical, playing that normative function in setting the tone and providing legitimacy and a strong moral basis for action and advocacy, as Serena was talking about. Then we have rights as legal, as a potential enforcement mechanism, albeit one that tends towards a narrower focus as enforcement gets stronger, and one that isn't currently accessible to everybody in every country. And then we have rights as practical, so acknowledging context as really crucial to action on rights and calling for a strengthening of things like participation and accountability, those really practical aspects. So in our research, as well as looking specifically at Zambia, we argue that explicitly acknowledging the existence of these rhetorical, legal, and practical functions of human rights is a really important first step, whatever sector or discipline or perspective you come from originally. And then addressing those three aspects of a right to nutrition altogether, instead of by very separate constituencies of lawyers and policymakers and activists as happens now, is really fundamental to a coherent rights-based approach to nutrition. So that's just an example of some academic research on a really practical issue of rights that can bring academic understanding and ideas to the further action that we've all been talking about. So let's move on to our final piece, and then hopefully we have time for a little bit of discussion. So over to you, Sweta.
All right, great. Thanks, Jody, for that presentation. And so, so far we've heard about the application of the right to food as it relates to policy, as it relates to law, research, and I will be speaking about an implementation action research project called the People-Centered Food Systems Project. And it's a new project, which has only started this year, so we're very much in our infancy, but what I'm sharing today on behalf of our team is what is the planned undertakings over the next 5 years. So as I said, I'm presenting this on behalf of colleagues, and this work is being undertaken by a consortium, which includes Ricolto, IIRR, CIAD Bioversity, Johns Hopkins University, and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And really what this project responds to is the challenge that there are constraints that impede marginalized and vulnerable food systems actors, from one, participating in decisions that inhibit them from realizing their rights to food security, healthy diets, and improved nutritional outcomes, from adapting to and mitigating against climate change and other food system related challenges, as well as fully contributing to and benefiting from their food systems. And the People-Centered Food Systems project in its first phase is seeking to address some of these challenges in 4 pilot countries, namely Ethiopia, Honduras, Cambodia, and Uganda. And so, talking about the rights, and I see some questions somewhat related to this, is, talking about the importance of the right to food is crucial, but how do we actualize this and use existing human rights instruments and tools with governments and rights holders to improve food systems specifically, and ultimately the right to food. The project itself, other than recognizing the constraints that rights holders are facing in terms of benefiting from their food systems, also recognizes the complexity of the food systems itself. As you see here, this is the adapted version of the HLP food systems framework, showing the food systems in, with all its different components and where there can be issues of rights violations, and so it's complex. And the project recognizes that human rights are indeed relevant to food systems if we are to, achieve a right to food and to realize that. And we aim to apply a human rights lens to this broader food systems framework. So, how do we hope to do this? And I think Serena's already worked. I think our entire panel has walked us through some of the tools that we have on hand to do this. And there's a range of relevant human rights instruments, as well as frameworks and guidelines already available to us to leverage rights-based approaches within food systems. Namely, at least within our project, we are leveraging the 2018 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, otherwise called UNDRAP, the voluntary guidelines on land tenure, voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, and the voluntary guidelines to support the progressive realization of the right to food. And beyond these tools, we are also leveraging the extended version of the International Bill of Human Rights. And this includes the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So ultimately, the project goal is to use advocacy, build capacity, and develop accountability tools that better integrate human rights frameworks within food systems policy and action to address these ongoing constraints by strengthening the capacity of both right holders and duty bearers. The approach we're hoping to take is really to undertake a set of activities that fall under these broad categories here. So under information, knowledge, and capacity, human rights frameworks, monitoring and accountability, policy coherence, and theory-based evaluation and learning. So in terms of information, knowledge, and capacity, our activities include awareness and capacity building of rights holders. That would be farmers, women, and youth, as well as policymakers and development partners, which are to include activities like trainings and mini courses. For the human rights framework, we will leverage the human rights instruments and frameworks I mentioned earlier to assist key stakeholders, rights holders, duty bearers, and even interveners in each pilot country to co-design and build national legal and policy frameworks that support the effective implementation of national and international human rights instruments related to food systems, related to human rights instruments within the context of food systems. So this includes awareness raising, and especially it will include policy dialogue workshops. And as it relates to monitoring and accountability, points that both I think Serena and David brought up in their presentations, we hope to use accountability and technical workshops to co-design and build national legal and policy frameworks that support the effective implementation of the previously mentioned human rights. So to build them into existing systems, monitoring systems. And then we have the policy coherence activities, which would include activities at the country level, examining coherence by way of political commitments and ratifications made officially on certain right to food related covenants, and then coherence on these commitments across sectors, as well as across ministries, and to to kind of examine particular policies, regulations, and or interventions pursued in one sector that may or may not be consistent with another, so as to achieve the right to food within the context of food systems. And then we'll also be looking at policy coherence at the international level to examine global norm setting processes for food systems, the right to food, and UNDROP at both national and subnational levels. And then finally, we are developing and plan to implement a theory-based evaluation of the project with the objective of documenting system-level changes observed around rights-based laws and legislation in the food system, as well as in international rights-based norms and guidelines during the course of the project period. And so ultimately what we're looking here to achieve here are these main outcomes. The first being improved access to information and the capacity of rights holders and duty bearers in the 4 countries, as well as internationally, so that these different stakeholders are in a better position to understand, value, and use UNDROP and these different voluntary guidelines and food systems relevant articles at the benefit of rural and peri-urban food producers. To ensure that there are drafted national legal and policy frameworks that support the implementation of UNDROP and the other human rights tools. And to do this via country-specific roadmaps through consultative approaches. To co-develop and have an integrated accountability and monitoring and accountability mechanism that is incorporated that specifically looks at human rights and food systems, that's incorporated into national systems and is leveraged by both organizations and governments to improve programming and implementation of policies, guidelines, and legislations at both the national and international levels. And to finally improve policy coherence at the national level between individual sectors and ministries, and at the international level as it relates to global norm setting processes related to food systems and the right to food. So with that, I will bring us to close to allow us some time for questions. And there were quite a few in the chat that I noticed. And what I'm going to do is to try to, I've collated a few. And I'm going to pose them to some of our panelists here who have already had some questions asked. So maybe we'll go first, Serena. There are a few for you that have a similar thematic theme to them. So one is in terms of international legally binding treaties, such as the Covenant, is there an issue on the enforcement of the right to food, in particular with the international dimension? And then there's similar questions about how can we realize a right to food when states have ratified certain covenants and they fail to meet their obligations. And there's a question of progressive realization. And what does that mean? How does one assess progressive realization? And especially in the context of crises that maybe we also find ourselves in today, with the current events. So I'll first start there, Serena, and allow you to answer before moving on to the next set of questions.
I'm happy to answer. I just put in the chat that I could have done it also in writing because I just want to make sure that we have the time, just because we are already 2 minutes past the end of the Side Event. Are we able to do this now? Is that okay? Or... Yeah,
if you'd like to stay on, that's fine. I can make one of you the hosts, and anyone who'd like to stay for questions, please.
No, it's okay. I have another meeting in 10 minutes, but I can perhaps just very quickly mention that, well, in terms of issues of enforcement, I mean, it is quite a difficult question, a very good one, but we cannot really generalize. The law is pretty clear on what should be done. Is the how that it's very, very diverse, and there is some guidance that is provided by many different tools that we have seen, some others that we haven't necessarily seen today or talked about, but ultimately it's a state duty, and it does very much comes down to the country context. We do have, as FAO, recorded and reviewed many examples of best practices on how the right to food has been progressively implemented. There was also a question about what that means. And essentially, there's no straight answer to this either, but it is about putting in place slowly a system that ensures that all the different pieces that the human rights law framework and the policy instruments that have been adopted by governments are actually put in place. So it's about taking the time to do it and ensuring that measures steps are taken in a sustainable manner. But we can go more in depth about that also in a bilateral exchange. And in the reviews that we have seen and the countries that have implemented it, there are very diverse ways of ensuring enforcement of these rights. It's through monitoring and accountability frameworks, by involving national human rights institutions, by having specific committees, advisory committees to the Office of the Prime Minister, which was, for instance, in the case of Nepal, or like in the case of Bolivia, everything started from a school feeding program that called a couple of regional bodies at the municipal level to institute adequate policies for those programs. And again, at the national level, that pushed for a national policies that pushed for the right to food to then being enacted at the constitutional level. So there are really, really many different ways that can happen. And it's very interesting for that. And I can provide some examples through some of our publications. Over.
Thank you, Serena. So we have time for maybe one more question to David. So David, someone's asking here about GMOs, and just appreciated the nuance you expressed when highlighting that technological solutions might not be the panacea that they seem to be. And so the thoughts, they're asking for your thoughts on whether you think that there's a role for international law to make agricultural technology more equitable, because you referenced Monsanto, for example. And I'll add in one more question here as to how you think a right to food or nutrition fits into a network of other human rights, which, such as rights to adequate living and standards, which is a broader question and maybe a good one to end on, given, I think what the answer might relate to. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Those two questions can take us for a full day of discussion, but let me try all that I can. If any African is understanding how we are going back to colonization and how we need to decolonize and how dangerous the so-called technology in food is going to wipe away all the food sovereignty, including the seed. Everyone should be waking up to say, no, let us stop it. Now, in international law, Serena has already indicated how the international legal framework under human rights can be taken very good use of. But the question is, can we implement it? And I'm making a case. We wouldn't be against technology per se. Technology is very good, but do we have the capacity? Do we understand what is in that technology? Do we understand what is in tissue and DNA editing? If a plant is edited, right now, we cannot access seeds. All the indigenous knowledge has been now rendered to be either useless or unbecoming. Yet it is a fact that 80% of the food that we eat comes from smallholder farmers. So the food technology, GMOs and everything is coming with all the discrimination, the kind of neoliberalism that comes with it, and colonialism. And I'm telling you, by the time we wake up, we are going to be slaves who can't feed ourselves. Because if someone is holding the seed, they hold you. If someone is holding the food, They hold you. And whereas in the Western developed economies, they can contain this because they have good democracies, they have good institutions, they can check on. I was on a study tour in Germany. You cannot fool around with, with chemicals. They even have a mechanism to find you in your garden. Here in Uganda, people can spray food and it finds you on your plate. So we are not safe. Women are not safe. Children are not safe. Everyone is not. So let me stop at that. And maybe it is a conversation we can take forward even beyond this platform.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. I think we might have to wrap up. I just want to touch upon how to keep these conversations going if people are interested. As Jody mentioned at the top of the hour, that this was very much to give a flavor of this work, to start some of these discussions within the ANH community and see if there's interest. And if you would like to keep this discussion going, I think each of our panelists have been open to continue answering questions that have been brought up in the chat. And so you can always go ahead and just click on the forum. I've also gone ahead and put it into the chat. Also, as we move forward with our respective projects, each of us are involved in different pieces of work. And with this new People-Centered Food Systems project, there's a FIRST projects as well as other groups that we might be engaged in a range of learning activities, knowledge sharing activities, and also just discussions. And so if you're interested to be kept in the loop about ongoing activities, please feel free to email myself, and we'll make sure that we're disseminating information and learning opportunities to the rest of the group. And so really excited to keep the engagement going to the best that we can. And I think with that, maybe bring us to a close. I think, Jody, should I hand over to you if you have anything left?
Nothing except just thank you so much to all of our speakers. It's been a fantastic hour together, never long enough, but great that we have these ways of keeping in touch. And certainly we will be monitoring those and being in touch with anyone who has further questions, and we can follow up with those specific questions. So great to see everybody today. Thank you, Serena. Thank you, David. And
thanks to the participants too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll see you in the next sessions.
All right.
Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you to our facilitators as well.